They said the woman was dead when the last shovelful of earth struck the lid. But that night, 3 men in the village swore they heard knocking from beneath the frozen ground. At first it came slowly, 3 dull knocks, then silence, then again. By morning, the grave had sunk inward, as if something below it had turned over and tried to rise. And when the priest ordered no one to speak of it, the children began whispering the same terrifying sentence in their sleep. She was breathing when they buried her. In the winter of 1648, in a village so small that most maps refused to name it, a woman was accused of witchcraft, condemned by fear, and buried beneath the earth before the bells of evening prayer had finished ringing. Her name does not survive in any complete record. In some tellings, she is called Eleanor Vane. In others, and of Black Hollow, a widow in certain accounts, a healer in others, a midwife, a heretic, a madwoman, a witch, but nearly every version of the story agrees on one terrible detail. She was not hanged. She was not burned. She was not drowned. She was buried alive. And what happened after her burial is the reason this story survived at all. Because villages forget shame. Churches bury scandal. Men destroy records when the truth threatens them. But fear keeps its own history. It lingers in the timber of old houses. It scratches beneath floorboards. It speaks from behind walls long after the mouths that formed it have rotted away. And in the years that followed the death of Eleanor Vane, the people of Black Hollow came to believe something far worse than witchcraft. They came to believe that the earth itself had refused to keep her. This is that story. So dim your lights, draw close to the fire, and listen carefully. Because before this night is over, you may find yourself asking the same question that haunted that village for generations. What if she was innocent, and they heard her too late? Black Hollow lay in the north, beyond the better roads, beyond the safer churches, beyond the reach of men who believed the world could be explained by law and scripture alone. It was a village built where the moorland dipped into marsh and woodland, where fog gathered low in the mornings and clung to the hedges until noon. In spring the ground sweated. In winter it froze hard enough to split fence posts. The houses were dark, narrow, and made of timber that groaned in the night when the wind came down from the hills. Nothing prospered there for long. Children died in Black Hollow with such frequency that the women had stopped embroidering names onto baby cloth before the first winter passed. Men were taken by fever, by drink, by horse kicks, by simple infection. Animals disappeared. Milk curdled unexpectedly. Oxen broke legs in dry fields. A man could spend half his life praying in Black Hollow and still be found dead in a ditch with his eyes open to the stars. So the people of that village lived as frightened people often do, with one face turned toward God, and the other toward whatever else might be listening. They nailed charms above doors. They whispered old protections under breath while attending Sunday sermons. They buried iron under thresholds. They turned shoes upside down to confuse spirits. They would deny such things in daylight and perform them faithfully by candlelight. And this was the world into which Eleanor Vane returned. She had not been born in Black Hollow, though her mother had. Years before, Eleanor had gone south with a husband old enough to be her father, a wool trader named Simon Vane. He died within 6 years. Some said of flux, some of a fall, some of shame after gambling away what little money he had. After his death, Eleanor did not remarry. That alone unsettled people. A young widow in those days was a dangerous thing to many eyes. A woman alone suggested secrets. A woman self-sufficient suggested pride. And a woman who survived misfortune without the protection of a husband invited suspicion from every side. When Eleanor returned to Black Hollow, she did not return begging. She brought a cart of books, dried herbs, a chest of linen, 2 iron pots, and enough coin to rent a narrow cottage near the edge of the birch wood. She mended the roof herself. She chopped her own wood. She spoke little, attended church irregularly, and refused offers of remarriage with a coolness that the men called arrogance and the women called unnatural. But what people remembered most were her hands. They were never idle. She gathered roots in winter, flowers in summer, bark in autumn. She knew which leaves eased swelling, which seeds calmed the bowels, which teas softened coughs, and which poultices drew infection from a wound before rot set in. Before long, villagers began coming to her after dusk when pride no longer mattered. Mothers with feverish sons, farmers with infected cuts, women with pains too private for the pastor's wife, and girls whose monthly bleeding had stopped after a soldier passed through. Eleanor helped where she could, and when she could not help, she sat beside the bed until the end. That, perhaps, was her greatest crime. Because in villages built on terror, the person most familiar with death quickly becomes the person most blamed for it. At first, they called her useful, then strange, then unfortunate, then cursed. And once enough misery gathered around her door, they began using a different word, which it began, as these stories often do, with things small enough to dismiss. A calf born without eyes. A row of cabbages found blackened after a night of frost when every other garden remained untouched. The miller's daughter waking from sleep with blood under her nails, claiming she had dreamed of a woman standing at the foot of her bed and breathing into her mouth. Then came the winter sickness. It spread through Black Hollow faster than the priest could carry oil from one bedside to another. Children burned with fever. Their joints swelled. Their breath came in short rattles. And in the worst cases they turned their heads toward empty corners of the room as if listening to someone who was not there. 3 died in 9 days. A 4th child, little Elsie Mercer, survived, but woke screaming each night that a woman in wet burial clothes was calling to her from beneath the floorboards. Her mother asked what woman. The child replied over and over with the same answer. The one you buried. No one in that house had buried anyone. Not recently, but the word spread. By week's end, people were repeating them at the well, at the bakehouse, in whispers outside the church. Then the livestock began behaving strangely. Dogs growled at empty fields. Horses shied at the lane beside Eleanor's cottage. One goat was found strangled in its pen, though the latch remained closed from the inside. Another animal, a sow heavy with piglets, was discovered dead with its belly opened, though no knife was found and no tracks marked the snow around it. In a larger town, these things might have been misfortune. In Black Hollow, they became pattern. And fear loves patterns, even false ones. It was during this time that Reverend Matthew Vale began speaking more fiercely from the pulpit. Before the sickness, Vale had been a tired man. Thin, pale, and too scholarly for a village of mud and blunt superstition. He had once preached about humility, charity, and the corruptions of pride. Now his sermons changed. He spoke of hidden evil, of Satan entering households through women's tongues and men's appetites, of sin rotting the village from within. He named no one, but his eyes lingered too long on Eleanor's empty place in church. The truth was that Reverend Vale feared many things, and not all of them were spiritual. His wife had miscarried twice. His youngest son had stopped speaking after a fever and now spent hours staring at the fireplace, mouthing words with no sound. Worse still, some villagers had begun seeking Eleanor before seeking prayer. For a man whose power rested on invisible authority, There was no greater threat than visible relief. So when Martha Pike, a God-fearing widow with 7 surviving children and a reputation for righteous cruelty, claimed she saw Eleanor walking through the graveyard at midnight carrying a lantern with no flame, Reverend Vane did not dismiss it. He asked questions. Too many questions. Martha said Eleanor had stopped before the oldest graves, that she had knelt, that the air around her had gone still, that then, God help her, the church bell had moved without ringing, swaying on its rope as though something beneath the earth had tugged it. Others added details they had not witnessed. They always do. Someone said Eleanor had been seen speaking to a black hare near the woodline. Another claimed milk soured when she entered a house. A third swore the face of Christ blackened on a wall cross after she touched it. Every village has a moment when rumor hardens into evidence. In Black Hollow, that moment came when a boy named Jonah Reed disappeared. He was 9 years old, narrow-shouldered, fond of stealing apples, and known for wandering farther than he should. He vanished 2 days before Candlemas. The search lasted until dark. Men combed the woods. Women called his name through the lanes. At dawn, they found him barefoot in the old sheep field beyond Eleanor's cottage, kneeling in the snow with his hands sunk wrist-deep into the frozen mud. He was alive, barely. His lips were blue. His eyes were open. And when his father dragged him home and forced broth between his teeth, the boy whispered only one sentence before convulsions took him. She said the ground is full of mouths. He died before sunset. From that moment on, Eleanor Vane no longer lived beside the village. She lived against it. They came for her at dusk. Not soldiers, not proper officers. Only men from the village, armed with lanterns, cudgels, and the courage that comes when cruelty is shared among many hands. Reverend Vane was with them. So was Abraham Pike, who had lost 2 infants in 2 years and needed someone to blame before grief split him in half. So was Thomas Harrow, the gravedigger, old and stooped, who did not want to be there but came because men like him had little right to refuse. They found Eleanor inside her cottage, seated at the table, trimming roots with a small blade. She did not scream. She did not flee. She only looked at the men entering her home as though she had expected them. That, too, they considered suspicious. Martha Pike later swore Eleanor smiled. Thomas Harrow later swore she did not. What is known is this: the men overturned her shelves. They cut open sacks. They pried up floorboards. They tore apart bedding and split the seams of pillows in search of bones, charms, or devil's marks. And because frightened men can always find what they need, they found plenty. Dried bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters. Glass jars filled with oils. A book in Latin none of them could read. A wax figure wrapped in thread. 3 teeth kept in a pouch. A dead raven under the bed, though whether it had been there before they arrived or appeared by accusation afterward, no one could later agree. Eleanor answered their questions plainly. The herbs were remedies. The Latin book had belonged to her husband. The wax figure was used for teaching childbirth positions to frighten mothers. The teeth were her own, taken after an illness in the South. As for the raven, she said she had never seen it. But explanation is useless once judgment has already been made. Reverend Vane demanded she strip her sleeves to the elbow. He searched for marks on the skin, teats for suckling familiars, scars that might hide infernal signs, moles shaped like symbols. They found an old burn near her wrist. Martha Pike gasped as if witnessing proof from heaven. Eleanor laughed then, not loudly, not wildly, just once, bitter and short, and that laugh frightened them more than tears would have. because tears might have made her human. Laughter made her unknowable. They dragged her to the church cellar and locked her there without formal charge. No trial had yet been called. No magistrate had spoken. But Black Hollow no longer needed law. Black Hollow had reached that dangerous stage in collective fear when punishment becomes a form of reassurance. And through that first night beneath the church, Eleanor did not cry out. She only asked Thomas Harrow for water when he came down with a lantern. Thomas would later say that her voice was calm. Too calm, people insisted. Yet he remembered something else as well, something he never told the others. She had dirt beneath her fingernails already, as though she had spent the day digging. When he handed her the cup, she looked at him and asked a question so quietly that he nearly pretended not to hear it. "Thomas," she said, "if they bury me, how deep will you dig?" He did not answer. He told himself later that he remained silent because he was frightened. But in his private confession, written years afterward in a trembling hand, he admitted a worse truth. A part of him already knew. There are forms of torture that leave no obvious wound. Sleep deprivation, cold, isolation, the slow grinding humiliation of being examined like livestock by people who already hunger for your destruction. For 5 days Eleanor was kept in the cellar beneath the church. She was denied proper sleep. Whenever her head dipped, someone banged on the door or threw water through the bars. They made her stand for hours. They forced her to repeat prayers while men watched for hesitation. They searched her body again, more thoroughly this time, under the supervision of Martha Pike and 2 other women who turned every bruise into evidence and every silence into confession. When Eleanor asked under what authority she was held, Reverend Vale answered that divine authority outranked any earthly court. When she asked to see a magistrate, he told her the magistrate had been sent for. This was true, but the man lived far enough away that winter roads delayed him. And fear, once fed, does not like to wait for procedure. Each day brought fresh testimony. A child said Eleanor's shadow moved the wrong direction at sunset. A farmer claimed he heard her speaking in 2 voices through a hedge. A woman whose infant had died months before now remembered seeing Eleanor touch the cradle. Jonah Reed's mother swore the boy had become pale the very day Eleanor glanced at him in the lane. Even those with no accusation to offer found one eventually. That is the nature of public hysteria. To remain silent is to risk suspicion yourself. So silence becomes impossible. On the 6th night, they brought Eleanor into the vestry for questioning. There was a table, 2 candles, Reverend Vale, Martha Pike, and Abraham Pike. Thomas Harrow stood at the back because the room was small and someone had to guard the door. Snow tapped against the shutters. Wax ran down the candles like pale tears. Eleanor had not slept properly in nearly a week. Still, she stood straight. Vale asked if she had entered into covenant with the devil. No. Did she keep a familiar? No. Did she blight crops, spoil milk, afflict children, torment livestock, or speak with the dead? No. Did she deny that evil walked the village? No, she said. Evil absolutely walked the village. That answer angered them. Martha demanded to know what she meant. Eleanor looked from one face to another and said, "I mean only that it wears the shape of neighbors." Thomas Harrow later said the room grew so still then that he could hear the fire settling in the next chamber. Abraham Pike struck the table with both palms and shouted that she was mocking them. Vale asked whether she repented. Repented for what? For secret arts. For pride. For tempting good women away from prayer and toward remedies. For setting herself above God. At that, Eleanor finally seemed tired. Not frightened, only tired. she said. When your children burned with fever, you sent for me after dark. When your wives bled too long, you came to my door. When the pain became unbearable, you begged for help with hands that shook. I gave what knowledge I had. Now death has visited you, as it visits every house, and because you cannot strike at heaven, you strike at me. Martha spat in her face. Abraham called her serpent. Reverend Vale said something then that would define everything that followed. He said, "If you are innocent, why does misfortune gather where you walk?" Eleanor turned slowly toward him, and in a voice so faint that Thomas barely heard it, she replied, "Because you bring it with you." That was the end of any hope she had. The next morning, before the magistrate arrived, a rumor spread that Eleanor had confessed in the night. No written confession existed. No witness agreed on its wording. Some said she admitted to seeing spirits in the wood. Others said she named Satan as her master. Still others claimed she laughed and promised vengeance from beneath the soil. But once people want a confession, they do not require details. They require only permission. And by the time the magistrate finally came to Black Hollow, shivering in a fur-lined coat and annoyed to have ridden so far for village madness, the case had already been decided in every heart that mattered. His name was Justice Edwin Bell, a narrow-faced man with careful speech and a habit of rubbing two fingers together when he smelled inconvenience. He questioned the witnesses in the church hall. He listened to fever stories, dream visions, dead livestock, spoiled milk, and suspicious herbs. He asked if there was proof of maleficium, actual harm caused by deliberate sorcery. The villagers answered with certainty and no evidence. Bell was not a good man, but he was not quite a fool either. He likely understood that he was looking at panic dressed as righteousness. Perhaps, in another place, he would have dispersed the crowd with warnings and fines. But England in those years was full of rupture. Civil war, plague, hunger, religious zeal, the collapse of one order and the savage improvisation of the next. In such times, law often bent itself around fear rather than opposing it. And Justice Bell noticed something else as he questioned the room. Reverend Vale wanted Eleanor condemned. That mattered. In remote villages, men of the cloth often carried more practical weight than distant law. Bell asked Eleanor whether she had anything to say in her own defense. She had many things to say, but she understood by then that truth had no purchaser there. So she spoke only this: "I am no witch, but if you bury a lie long enough, it will come up through the roots." The hearing lasted most of the day. At dusk, Bell delivered a judgment so evasive that history has argued over it ever since. He did not declare Eleanor guilty of witchcraft in the formal sense. He said instead that she was a dangerous corrupter, a woman of malignant influence, and an object of scandal whose continued presence endangered the spiritual peace of the parish. He left her fate to ecclesiastical discretion and village custody until higher review could be sought. Higher review never came, because Black Hollow heard in his weakness exactly what it wanted: permission to do something terrible. Had Reverend Vale truly wished to save her, he might have delayed. He might have requested transfer. He might have appealed to another authority. Instead, he called a private meeting that night with Abraham Pike, Martha Pike, Thomas Harrow, and 5 other men whose names survive only Ashake signatures in a parish ledger. The official record refers to a necessary act of restraint. That phrase appears in faded ink beside no further explanation. But Thomas Harrow's confession, written 23 years later when he believed himself near death, provides the missing horror. According to Harrow, Reverend Vale argued that ordinary punishment would not suffice. If Eleanor were imprisoned elsewhere, she might spread corruption. If she were hanged without conviction, questions might be asked. If she escaped, she would return in wrath. The old stories, Martha Pike insisted, were clear. Some witches did not die easily. Some spat nails from the gallows. Some rose from graves. Some had to be pinned to the earth where roads crossed or where blessed ground thinned near its edges. And someone, Thomas never wrote, who suggested burial. Not as execution, they told themselves, as containment, as spiritual quarantine, as a means of sealing wickedness below the world of the living. This is how ordinary people commit atrocities. Not by saying, "Let us do evil," but by saying, "Let us do what is necessary." Thomas Harrow objected once. He wrote that he said, "If she is not dead, then it is murder." No one answered him directly. Reverend Vane only placed a hand over the gravedigger's wrist and said, "Then pray she has already yielded her soul." Outside, snow fell softly over the graveyard. Inside the church, men made room for damnation and called it duty. They came for Eleanor before dawn. The village was still. No bell rang. No public sentence was read. This was not justice. Justice likes witnesses. This was something else. Thomas Harrow had been ordered to dig beside the old boundary wall at the far edge of the churchyard, where the ground sloped toward the more and older graves had sunk crooked over the years. It was poor ground, stony, frozen, reluctant. He dug by lantern light until his shoulders trembled. By sunrise, the hole was deep enough to shame the living and not deep enough to hide what they were about to do. They brought Eleanor out with her hands bound. There was no coffin, only a rough wooden bier and a wool shroud laid over it. Thomas would remember, until the day he died, the steam of her breath in the cold air. Breath, that was what ruined him, because whatever the others told themselves later, no one standing there could mistake what they were doing. She was alive, weak, sleep-starved and half-frozen perhaps, but alive. Martha Pike refused to look at her face. Abraham Pike stared with the rigid fury of a man who believed cruelty would finally quiet his grief. Reverend Vane held a prayer book but did not open it. When they reached the grave, Eleanor seemed to understand at once. She did not beg. That unsettled them more than pleading would have. Instead, she looked down into the pit, then toward the village beyond the wall, smoke just beginning to rise from a few chimneys. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse from cold and thirst. "If there is still mercy in any of you," she said, "do not make me hear the earth." Thomas Harrow nearly dropped the lantern. He wrote later that this sentence followed him into sleep for 20 years. Reverend Vane told her to confess. She said there was nothing to confess. Martha Pike said a hardened which often died unrepentant. Abraham demanded it be done quickly. Someone, again Thomas never named who, bound Eleanor's ankles. Another tied cloth over her mouth, claiming she might curse them. Thomas had to climb into the grave to help lower her because the others feared touching her longer than necessary. When he took her weight beneath the arms, he felt how thin she had become during those cellar days. Her ribs pressed against his wrists. Her skin was cold, but not the cold of death. She looked at him once, only once, and in that look he saw no sorcery, no devil, no fury. Only the raw animal knowledge of a human being realizing that other human beings have stepped beyond redemption. She made a sound behind the cloth, not a curse, a sob, that almost broke him. Almost, but almost is the word cowards hide behind. They laid her at the bottom of the grave on the shroud. Reverend Vane began to pray. His voice shook on the second line. Martha Pike cast down a handful of salt. Abraham Pike threw the first spade of dirt. It struck Eleanor's legs with a soft thud. She convulsed. Thomas could not breathe. Another shovelful came. Then another. Eleanor twisted, trying to sit up, but the ropes held her awkwardly and the walls were narrow. The cloth over her mouth darkened where she breathed against it, each exhale wetting the wool. Then she began to scream. Even muffled, the sound was unmistakable. Alive, terrified, human. Thomas stumbled backward from the edge and said they must stop. Martha shouted that it was the devil crying out through her. Abraham shouted louder, throwing dirt faster. Others joined in. There is a point in every group crime when each participant becomes desperate for the act to be completed, because completion offers the only hope of numbing what conscience has already seen. So they worked with frantic speed. Dirt fell over her stomach, her chest, her face. For one moment her bound hands broke upward through the loose soil, fingers spread wide, grasping at air already thick with earth. Thomas heard the nails rake stone. Then the hands vanished. The grave filled. The ground was tamped. A crude wooden marker was hammered into the frozen soil without name, without prayer, without date. And over the disturbed earth, Reverend Vale finally finished the words he had begun. May the Lord keep this parish from evil. No one answered amen. As the others turned away, Thomas Harrow remained staring at the fresh mound, unable to move. He told himself there could be no sound now, that enough soil lay between this world and the next. Then he heard it. 3 knocks, soft, hollow, from below. He looked up in horror. Abraham Pike had heard them too. Thomas knew because the man's face went pale beneath his beard. But Martha Pike grabbed Abraham's arm and hissed, "Do not listen." So they walked away and left the gravedigger alone with the sound of a buried woman striking weakly at the dark. All that day Black Hollow carried on as though nothing had happened. Bread was baked. Water was drawn. A cart axle was repaired near the smithy. Children chased one another in boots too large for their feet. And yet beneath every ordinary motion moved a trembling new awareness, because secrets do not stay buried among people who share them. They become a second weather, a pressure in the room, a silence too carefully maintained. No one spoke Eleanor's name. By evening, a hard frost had set over the village. Smoke from chimneys rose straight into the darkening sky. Reverend Vale locked the church and drank more brandy than usual. Martha Pike scrubbed her hands until the skin reddened and told her daughters not to ask questions. Abraham Pike sat by the fire without touching his supper. Thomas Harrow remained in his cottage with both palms pressed over his ears, though there was nothing yet to hear. The knocking began after midnight. At first Thomas believed it was a dream. 3 slow blows, then a pause, then 2, then many, faster, more frantic. He sat up in bed, his heart thudding. The sound was not coming from his door, nor his wall. It seemed to arrive through the ground itself, faint but distinct, like wood struck from far below. He lit a candle and waited. Silence. Then, carried through the frozen air from the direction of the churchyard, came something worse. A single cry, muffled, short, so thin it might have been the scream of a fox. But Thomas had helped lower her. He knew that voice. He did not sleep again. At dawn he went to the graveyard. He found Reverend Vale already there, standing over Eleanor's burial place with his cloak pulled tight against the wind. The grave had sunk in the middle, not by much, just enough to show that the loose soil had shifted, and across the top were shallow disturbances, as though something beneath had moved upward before failing. Thomas said, "We must dig." Vale answered, No. Thomas said she might have lingered through the night. Vale closed his eyes and said, "Then God has judged her now." It is difficult to say which man was more frightened in that moment, the one begging to exhume her or the one refusing. Because to open the grave would mean more than discovery. It would mean acknowledgement. And if the body showed what Thomas feared it would show, no prayer in Black Hollow would wash the stain from their hands. So the priest ordered the mound leveled again. Thomas obeyed. He obeyed because people rarely become brave after cowardice has already purchased their silence. That evening, children in 3 separate homes woke screaming that someone was walking around their beds, barefoot and dripping earth. One of them was Reverend Vale's son, who had not spoken in months. He sat upright in darkness and whispered with startling clarity, "She cannot breathe." When Vale's wife asked who he meant, the boy replied, "The woman under the wall." Then he fell silent again and would not speak another word for 2 years. In the days that followed, Black Hollow changed. Not outwardly at first. Outwardly, nothing so dramatic. There was no lightning from clear skies, no black flocks circling the church, no blood in the well. The changes were quieter, more intimate, which made them more terrible. No one could sleep through the night. People woke at the same hour, some just after 1, others close to 3, with the conviction that they had heard someone moving around their room. A drag of cloth, a wet breath, the whisper of bare feet over dirt instead of floorboards. Martha Pike found mud on her windowsill, though the snow outside remained unbroken. Abraham Pike heard knocking from inside his hearth and smashed part of it apart with an iron poker before dawn. Reverend Vale dreamed each night that he stood in the churchyard while hands pushed slowly upward through the soil, not clawing but reaching, as if asking to be taken hold of. At the same time, a new rumor spread. The church bell, which hung silent except for service, had begun to tremble at night. No sound, just movement. A sacristan's wife claimed she saw the rope swaying on its own through the crack of the tower door. Another said she heard a dull vibration in the bell metal, as though something deep underground were striking in rhythm no human hand could hear. Then came the dogs. Every dog in Black Hollow began avoiding the graveyard lane. They whined, dug in their paws, and refused to pass the boundary wall where Eleanor had been buried. One mongrel slipped its collar, ran into the churchyard at dusk, and had to be beaten away from the grave mound after it began digging furiously and howling with such distress that women crossed themselves from their windows. Thomas Harrow watched all this with growing horror. He wanted to speak. He wanted to tell the village what he had heard. But he feared that confession would not save him. It would only make him first among the damned. So he drank, prayed, and listened to the ground. On the 4th night after the burial, a storm came down from the moor, wind, sleet, and rain so cold it stung like thrown gravel. Near midnight the church bell rang once. Only once. A single groan of metal, enough to wake half the village. Men came out with lanterns. Women stood at doorways clutching shawls. They found no one in the tower, no one in the church. But at the edge of the graveyard, rain had washed part of Eleanor's mound flat, and in the exposed earth near the top were 2 furrows, narrow and curved, like marks left by fingers dragging upward from beneath. Abraham Pike called it settling soil. Martha Pike called it temptation. Thomas Harrow said nothing. Yet all through that next day one thought spread, unspoken but alive in every eye. What if she had still been alive when the grave was closed? By evening, even those who hated Eleanor most no longer spoke of witchcraft with conviction. They spoke instead with the guilty urgency of people trying to decide whether the horror outside them might simply be the echo of the horror within. Only Reverend Vale stood firm. He told the village fear was Satan's last weapon. He told them not to dig. He told them the dead should remain with the dead. But his own face had begun to change. The skin under his eyes darkened. His lips trembled during prayer. Once, while reciting a psalm, he lost his place and stared at the church floor as if he heard something beneath it. Whatever faith had armed him at the burial was now turning in his grip. And then, on the seventh day, Thomas Harrow dug where no one could see. He went at dusk with a spade, a lantern hooded against the wind, and enough terror in his chest to stop a weaker man's heart. He told no one, not because he was noble, because if he found nothing, he could preserve the lie. And if he found what he feared, he could no longer blame the others for not facing it before him. The grave was harder to open than to fill. The upper earth had frozen again. He hacked through clods and stone with fingers numbed by cold. Sweat soaked his shirt despite the weather. Each scrape of spade against soil sounded too loud beneath the watching sky. He was halfway down when the smell reached him. Not the full rot of a long burial. Something else. Wet wool. Cold clay. The sourness of panic trapped in closed air. Thomas nearly climbed back out. Instead, he dug faster. At last, the spade struck fabric. He dropped to his knees and clawed earth aside with bare hands until the shroud appeared, soaked and blackened with mud. Eleanor's body lay twisted partly onto one side, not flat as they had left her. Her knees were drawn upward, her shoulders hunched. The cloth that had bound her mouth had slipped to her throat. Her face. Thomas Harrow wrote that he could not fully describe her face without feeling his own soul recoil. The mouth was open wide, packed with mud. The lips had torn. The skin of her cheeks was scored where grit had rubbed against them. Her eyelids were not fully closed. One eye stared upward through caked soil as though still searching for light. Her fingers were the worst part. Every nail had broken. The fingertips were raw to the bone. There was blood beneath the nails, blood on her wrists where the bindings had cut deeper as she struggled, and blood dried around her nostrils where she had fought for breath inside the earth itself. No which had lain peacefully there. No corpse had been committed to rest. A living woman had awakened inside the grave, or remained conscious long enough after burial, and tried with everything in her body to claw her way back into the world. Thomas dropped the lantern. It tipped, went out, and plunged the grave into darkness. In that blackness, with Eleanor's ruined face inches from his own, Thomas heard a sound. He swore until death it was real. Faint exhale. Not from her mouth, from the soil around her, as if the earth were remembering the last breath it had stolen. He screamed and scrambled from the grave, half mad with terror, and ran straight to Reverend Vale's house. The priest opened the door in his nightshirt, candle shaking in hand. Thomas told him everything, every detail, the broken nails, the blood, the bent body, the open eye. For a long time Vale said nothing. Then he did something stranger than grief, stranger than horror. He crossed himself, though his own church did not practice that gesture. Then he whispered, "No one must see." Thomas stared at him in disbelief. Vale gripped his shoulder so hard the old man winced. "No one must see," he repeated. "Do you understand? If this comes out, it destroys us all. The village will turn on itself. The parish will be shamed. They will say we murdered her. They will be right." Thomas asked what could possibly be done. Vale answered, "Cover her again." In that moment Thomas Harrow finally understood the full measure of evil. Not frenzy, not panic, not even burial, but the cold insistence, After truth is plainly revealed, that truth must still be hidden. Thomas left the priest's house without agreeing. He stood in the lane under a sky raw with stars, trembling from head to heel. And for the first time since Eleanor Vane had been accused, he chose not obedience, not silence, but action. He went instead to Martha Pike's door, then Abraham's, then the miller's, then any house where he thought shame had not yet fully devoured conscience. By dawn, half the village stood in the graveyard, and Black Hollow saw what it had done. The reactions differed. Some wept immediately, some vomited. Martha Pike fell to her knees and began praying so fast her words lost shape. Abraham Pike backed away from the grave with both hands over his face, muttering that it was a trick, a devil's trick, that no innocent woman could look like that after death. But innocence was precisely what the grave proclaimed. Not by saintly beauty, not by miracle, by agony, by the unmistakable evidence of someone who had fought desperately, horribly, for life against impossible darkness. Eleanor's body told the story more truthfully than any surviving witness ever could. She had lived after burial, for minutes, perhaps longer, long enough to wake in blackness, long enough to realize where she was, long enough to struggle until the ropes cut her raw and her own blood mixed with soil, long enough to die not by law, nor fire, nor rope, but by terror. No one present could deny it, and yet even then, with guilt yawning open beneath them, the village still divided into two kinds of people: those who believed a terrible crime had been committed, and those who preferred to believe the horror itself proved she had not been entirely human. That is how deep superstition can root itself. Show some people innocence flayed open before their eyes, and they will still cling to the lie that excuses them. Reverend Vale arrived last. When he looked into the grave, whatever remained of his certainty left him. He swayed. For one strange second it seemed he might confess publicly, might fall beside the opened earth and admit everything. Instead he whispered, "Cover her." Thomas Harrow answered with unusual strength. "No." The word shocked everyone. Thomas repeated it. No more dirt, no more lies. So they carried Eleanor from the grave and laid her inside the church on a board usually used for washing bodies. Women cleaned the mud from her face. Men stood outside unable to enter, as though the threshold itself burned. And there, beneath candlelight, with every broken nail and every torn finger visible, the story of Black Hollow changed forever. Because from that point on, the villagers could no longer ask whether Eleanor was a witch, only whether the dead forgive. If this had been merely a tale of injustice, perhaps it would have ended there. A crime revealed, a village shamed, proper burial at last. But Black Hollow remembered the weeks that followed not as repentance, but as visitation. After Eleanor's body was cleaned and reburied, this time in a coffin, this time with witnesses, this time in consecrated ground near the chapel wall, peace did not return. It fled farther. Those most responsible began to unravel first. Martha Pike heard scratching every night from inside her walls. At dawn she would find plaster crumbled beneath the bed as if nails had worked at it from the other side. Her daughters said she walked the house by candlelight whispering apologies to corners. One morning she was found in the yard clawing at frozen soil with her bare hands, insisting someone was still beneath it. Abraham Pike stopped entering church. He claimed the smell of fresh earth followed him everywhere. Bread tasted of clay. Ale tasted of clay. Even clean water from the well carried grit against his teeth. He lost weight quickly and told neighbors a woman stood in the field outside his house at dusk, her face hidden by burial linen, waiting for him to admit what he had done. Within a month he put a pistol in his mouth and failed only because the powder flashed wet. After that he refused firearms, saying metal remembered. Reverend Vale's punishment was quieter. He continued preaching. He continued visiting the sick. He continued speaking about sin. But each sermon grew stranger. He would stop mid-sentence and listen. He would glance toward the church floorboards. Once, while reading Lazarus raised from the tomb, he shut the Bible abruptly and walked from the pulpit without blessing the congregation. His wife told one neighbor, in confidence, that he woke before dawn with dirt in his fists, though he had gone to bed clean. His son, the mute boy, began drawing pictures on scraps of paper. All of them showed the same thing: a woman lying underground with open eyes, while roots grew through the ribs of the men standing above her. And then there were the voices, not voices in the grand ghost story sense. No spectral proclamations booming through halls. Something subtler, more intimate. People alone in kitchens, barns, or lanes at twilight would hear a woman speak just behind them in a breath-thin whisper. Too deep, or it was dark, or worst of all, I was still here. The miller's wife heard it while kneading dough. Thomas Harrow heard it while emptying chamber pots. Reverend Vale heard it, according to his final journal, every time he passed the boundary wall. He wrote, in cramped script, "There is no greater terror than a sentence unfinished by death. The village tried everything. More prayer, more candles, a day of fasting, salt in the lanes, scripture buried at the edge of the churchyard. A traveling minister from another parish who declared the matter one of guilt, not haunting, and left before nightfall after his horse broke free and bolted from the stable bleeding at the gums. Whatever stalked Black Hollow did not perform for crowds. Preferred conscience. It chose the guilty and met them in solitude. And because guilt is a chamber that echoes louder than any crypt, the line between haunting and madness became impossible to draw. Years after the events at Black Hollow, fragments of Reverend Matthew Vale's private journal surfaced among the effects of a relative. Most pages were damaged. Some were deliberately cut. But enough remained to reveal the collapse of a man who had once believed himself an instrument of righteousness. At first, the entries are defensive. He writes that harsh measures had been necessary, that scandal threatened the village, that disorder spreads quickly where women practice unsanctioned arts. He repeats, almost obsessively, that Eleanor was proud. This matters because guilt often begins by rearranging the victim into something more deserving. But the later entries change. Sleep leaves him. He writes that each night he dreams of suffocation, not his own, hers. He dreams not from inside the grave, but from above it, hearing movement below and lacking the courage to command it opened. Then he begins recording phenomena. A wet footprint in the vestry, a line of dirt across the communion table, the smell of turned soil in the bell tower. He insists these things are real. He also insists in the next sentence that they cannot be. In one fragment he writes, "I begin to suspect that hell does not open beneath us after death. It opens first in memory. Whatever walks this parish may be spirit, or merely the shape of our deed reflected back by God. Yet if punishment can mimic haunting so perfectly, who shall say there is difference?" The last complete entry is dated 11 months after Eleanor's burial. It reads, "I went today to the second grave. The earth there is undisturbed. Yet I heard from below, not a knocking now, but a slow dragging, as of nails through wood softened by damp. I knelt and pressed my ear to the ground. There came no voice, only breath or the memory of breath. I have led these people into a sin no sermon can name. If justice exists, It does not wait for death. It sleeps lightly beneath our feet. 3 days after that entry, Reverend Vale disappeared. He did not flee with money. He did not take a horse. His coat remained in the house. His boots stood by the hearth. The door was unlatched. Behind the church, near Eleanor's first grave by the boundary wall, searchers found disturbed earth and one object half buried in the mud. Vale's prayer book, swollen with rain, open to the passage, "Dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return." No body was ever found. This, more than anything, completed the legend. Because a guilty priest may run. A guilty priest may kill himself. But a priest who vanishes near the grave of a woman he helped bury alive offers the imagination something too rich to resist. Black Hollow did not merely tell the story thereafter. It inherited it. Thomas Harrow outlived nearly everyone involved. Perhaps that was punishment enough. He dug graves for another 2 decades. Children grew into adults and still crossed themselves when passing him. He drank heavily. He spoke rarely. And in old age, when his hands had gone crooked and his lungs rattled in winter, he finally wrote the account from which much of this nightmare survives. The confession is not elegant. It is full of crossings out, repetitions, pleas for mercy, and sentences that lose themselves in grief. But among its most chilling lines is this one: "I think often that the true grave was not hers but ours. For after that morning we all lived as people buried with breath remaining." He admits his cowardice. He admits hearing the knocks before the others. He admits tamping the grave after the first night because Reverend Vale ordered him to. He admits that he told himself she had perhaps died quickly, though the sounds proved otherwise. And then, near the end, he reveals something that changed how later generations understood Eleanor Vane. He writes that on the night before the burial, when he brought her water in the cellar, she asked him not only how deep the grave would be, she asked him something else as well. She said, "When they are afraid enough, will anyone remember what truly happened to the Pike child?" Thomas says he did not know what she meant then. But after her death, an old woman from the village, one who had attended Abraham Pike's wife during childbirth, told him a rumor she had kept hidden out of terror. Months before the accusations began, Martha Pike's youngest infant had died not from witchcraft, but from a sleeping draught given in desperate excess. The mother had sought herbs from Eleanor to calm the child's seizures. Eleanor had refused the stronger measure, warning it might stop the baby's breathing. Martha, panicked and unwilling to watch another child suffer, tried the mixture herself using old household lore. The infant died. Afterward, Martha blamed Eleanor privately, then publicly, then with such force that blame transformed into belief. If this rumor is true, and there is no record to prove it, then the whole destruction of Eleanor Vane may have begun not with sorcery, but with a mother's unbearable guilt seeking a body onto which it could be fastened. Thomas offers no conclusion. He simply writes, "If she knew the child was not bewitched but poisoned by error, then perhaps she understood from the first why they would not let her live. A lie born of grief will kill to preserve itself." He died the same winter he finished the confession. Villagers claimed that, in his final fever, he kept lifting his hands above the blanket as though pushing upward through heavy soil. Time broke Black Hollow apart. Roads improved elsewhere and not there. Families left. The church roof collapsed in one century and was repaired in the next. The old boundary wall crumbled. The names of the Pikes faded from stones. Children hearing the tale no longer knew whether Eleanor Vane had truly existed or whether she was the village's way of dressing guilt in ghost shape. But one last story persisted. In late autumn, when the ground first hardened and the nights smelled of wet leaves and distant smoke. Some claimed a sound returned to the churchyard after midnight. Not always, not every year, just often enough to remain feared. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks again. Never loud, never theatrical, as though someone very tired still remembers the shape of asking. Visitors who came hoping for spectacle found nothing. The story did not reveal itself to the curious. Only to those alone or nearly alone, standing in the cold where the old graves leaned. A schoolteacher from a nearby town wrote in the 19th century that while passing through the ruined yard at dusk, he heard a muted striking from below, impossible to place, so suggestive of coffin wood that I left with shame rather than fear. That line matters. Shame rather than fear, because perhaps that is the final horror in the story of Eleanor Vane. Not that a witch returned, not that a grave opened, not even that a village killed an innocent woman in the name of piety, but that the true haunting of Black Hollow was moral, not supernatural. That every sound, every dream, every whisper in the dark may have been the mind's revolt against an act too monstrous to absorb. And yet, there remains the matter of Reverend Vale's disappearance. The bell, the voices heard by children who were too young to understand what adults had done. The mud on windowsills, the dragging beneath the church floor, and Thomas Harrow's insistence, maintained until his death, that when he first exhumed Eleanor and the lantern went out, something in the grave breathed. Not she, not exactly, something else, something made from pain, breath, earth, and unfinished terror. Perhaps that is what injustice leaves behind when burial is rushed and truth denied. Not a ghost in white wandering moonlit fields. Something worse. A memory with hunger. A wrong so complete it begins to imitate life. So if you ever hear this story told as a simple ghost tale, remember what lies beneath it. A woman returned to a frightened village with knowledge in her hands and no protection at her side. Misfortune gathered, as it always does. Fear searched for a face. Grief searched for blame. Authority searched for control. And together they made a grave for someone who could still feel the cold, still taste the dirt, still pray in the dark for one human hand to show mercy. No hand came. That is the true horror. Not witchcraft, not curses, not the old church bell moving in the night, but the moment a community decides that terror is righteousness, and that the suffering of one unwanted person can purchase the comfort of the rest. And if Black Hollow remained haunted, perhaps it deserved to be. Perhaps every knock beneath the frost was only history refusing to stay buried. Perhaps every whisper in the walls carried the same accusation across the years. You heard me, you knew, and still you walked away. So tonight, when your house falls quiet and the dark settles into the corners, ask yourself one final question. If you had stood at the edge of that grave and heard knocking from below, would you have opened it? Or would you, like the people of Black Hollow, have told yourself a necessary lie and left the earth to finish what fear began?